reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke. Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is unable to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." The word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I got in trouble in the 6th grade in Sunday school for saying that I hated my science teacher, Mrs. Lake. She was a truly awful person. She reminded me of Cruella de Vil from the animated movie 101 Dalmatians. Back in those days, teachers used overhead projectors in the classroom, and Mrs. Lake would lick her finger to erase the mistakes she made with the markers. And by the end of the day, her lips and her tongue would be blue from all of the ink that she had ingested. But she wasn't just absent-minded. She was cruel. She humiliated students in front of the whole class. I hated her for how she treated me and how she treated my classmates. And so I said so one Sunday morning in Sunday school. But instead of going deeper to understand what was going on in my young life, my Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Edsel, chastised me and told me that it was a sin to hate anyone or anything. 6th grade me wishes that I had been asked to memorize Luke 14:26 so that I could have proven Mrs. Edsel wrong. It's funny, isn't it, how we don't have kids memorize verses about hating their parents, isn't it? And so despite the fact that Jesus tells us to hate something right there in the Bible, for years I would hear Mrs. Edsel's voice in my head anytime I heard these difficult words of Jesus. Every time it happened, Jesus' own words would collide with what I learned in Sunday school. Sometimes his words are so challenging that not even theological education is enough to prevent the mental whiplash that happens when we trip across them, especially when they come up in the lectionary for preaching purposes, as they did earlier this year. Of course, we know, with the help of the commentators, who inevitably blame the whole thing on the translators, Jesus doesn't really mean hate. He doesn't mean to detest your family, one commentator says. In his day, the word hate meant to love less or to not choose. I suppose that's supposed to make us feel better. But it always felt rather unchristian for Jesus to say such an awful thing about my mom and dad. And I found it really hard to accept that in order to follow Jesus, I had to reject my family, because it was my family that first taught me about Jesus in the first place. Years later, when I was a student here at Brite, I was invited to and attended a radically inclusive church that met on Sunday evening that a lot of students attended, even the ones that had Sunday morning gigs in other congregations. One Tuesday evening at Bible study, one of these texts where Jesus tells his followers to hate their families came up for discussion. It would be the text for preaching that following Sunday. And even with the pastor's help in understanding the translation issues around the word that we translate into English as hate, most of us in that Bible study really struggled with the idea that being close to one's family should be an impediment to being a follower of Jesus. And even after we talked for quite a long time that night about how hate doesn't really mean hate, most of us just weren't buying it. But then a young man who had recently started coming to church with us found the courage to tell us his story. David came to the church because he had heard that we really meant it when we said we were radically inclusive. David grew up in a family and in a church that he knew would reject him if he came out of the closet. And that night in that Bible study, through sobs and tears, David told us about how, upon discovering this church, he had decided that in order to follow Jesus, he would have to leave both his biological and his church family behind. That night, while many of us were basically trying to argue with Jesus, David found in Jesus' words the courage to accept himself, and he came out of the closet fully aware of the life-changing consequences that would ensue. And that Bible study group and that church walked with him through that frightening and grief-filled period in his life. The church became his new family. And David became one of its most effective evangelists. So now, when I hear Jesus calling for his followers to hate their family and even life itself, I don't hear the voice of Mrs. Edsel chastising me anymore. I hear David's voice. And I hear what he said to us, a lesson that no commentary could teach any of us. Family isn't just something you're born into, he said. Family is something you can choose. That's as good a summary of the gospel as I have ever heard. Among the many, many tragic consequences that we lament during this season of remembering transgender folk whose lives have been lost to us through violence, one of the most tragic consequences on a cosmic level is the silencing of the lessons that we might have learned from each one of them. For I have continued to learn from my queer siblings, including 2 transgender students that I have had the privilege of walking with through the Supervised year here at Brite Divinity School. two former members of theological reflection groups that I have led here at Brite, came to school as Christians and converted to Judaism while studying for the MDiv degree. Both of them found that religious conversion was necessary in order to be fully the people that God had made them to be. And in Judaism, they found a home that the ostensibly open and affirming Christian spaces that they had previously occupied had not been able to provide. Their stories, a decade later, have helped me to revisit and deepen the lesson that I learned from David that night in Bible study. And I think it's just like God to use the stories of converts to Judaism to help me to re-examine my own Christian faith. I actually think that there is something about the difficulty of these words that make them somehow universally true. The translators tell us, rather the commentators tell us, that the translators got it wrong and that Jesus wasn't telling anyone to hate or detest anything, but instead to learn to love certain things less. And after the last 2 years, with all of the disruption and fear and uncertainty that we've endured as a global family, and all of the change that we continue to weather here at Brite Divinity School, I look to a future in which hoping for a stable new normal seems nothing but a pipe dream. What I have learned from Jesus' difficult words, and from David and Avery and Puck and many others who have made brave decisions to live as the person that God created them to be, is that God is asking us to love certain things more than we love familiarity or predictability or stability. Perhaps God is calling us to love the possibility and the potential of the new and the unknown more than we love the careful, the low risk, the same old, and the one I hear at church all the time, the way we've always done it. Perhaps our failure to love those things less impedes all of us from being fully the people that God has made us to be. I have also realized that these difficult words of Jesus can be a means of discernment. For as much as I have been drawn to Ignatian principles of consolation and desolation, in the last couple of years, I have found it very helpful to ask myself, when trying to make a decision, which of these things is Jesus asking me to love less? Maybe you can ask yourself the same questions. Brite students make huge sacrifices to come to seminary. Some have given up security of a lucrative profession. Others have risked rejection by family, friends, and churches in order to dedicate themselves to theological study. Still others have made the choice to study at Brite instead of one of those other schools that doesn't stretch their students as much as we do. At a time when the demographic data tells us that theological education and church life are undergoing rapid and radical change, it takes real courage to invest in a field with such an uncertain future. And yet here we are. Yes, I know that the translators tell us that Jesus wasn't asking us to hate or detest anyone or anything. So in that way, Mrs. Etzel was right. But instead, Jesus is asking us to learn to love certain things less. So perhaps you've been called to love financial security less. You've been called to love the naive faith of your Sunday school days less. Perhaps you've been called to love the approval of family and friends less. You chose advocacy and activism coming to Brite over a life of passive citizenship. And you chose a career path that is blown about by the blustery winds of the Holy Spirit instead of a future that is hemmed in by the unforgiving laws of capitalism and bottom-line thinking. When we're called out of our comfort zone by God, we are being faced with the same challenge that Jesus' followers faced that day when he told them to hate mom and dad. Okay, obviously he didn't mean that they had to hate their family. But it did mean that they had to love the reign of God more. He wanted his followers that day to know that being his disciple would not be easy. That it would mean giving up the comforts of routine. That it would mean to strike out on new adventures. That it would mean being misunderstood. That it would end in crucifixion. He wanted his followers to know that being his disciple would be as hard as it would have been for them to hate their mother or their father. But loving the reign of God more than other things isn't just a tough sell for a seminary community. It's a tough sell for people in the world that we are called to lead. It's a tough sell for people in churches that are already in the pews following Jesus. We could borrow a tagline from Bonhoeffer when he said that when Christ calls a person, he calls them to come and die. Our institutions seem to be taking his advice very seriously. And yet we are still called to lead and to invite people into a way of life that offers few material guarantees and little reward if you're doing it honestly, and a bewildering set of challenges. While the empire all around us tempts us with easier options, we are called to carry the cross. So let us be about the work of loving the family of God more than we love our own. Amen.